The fluorescent lights in the Johnson Mansion's marble foyer cast harsh shadows across Elena Martinez's face as she stood clutching her worn leather bag, watching Robert Johnson pace back and forth like a caged animal. His expensive Italian shoes clicked against the polished floor with each agitated step, and his face wore the expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Elena could feel his judgment radiating from across the room as he finally stopped pacing and turned to face her, his cold gray eyes scanning her from head to toe with barely concealed disgust. She knew what he was thinking. Here was another desperate woman, willing to take on the impossible job that 17 others had already fled from in terror. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension and unspoken accusations, until Robert finally spoke, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that comes naturally to those born into wealth and privilege. "So you're the one they sent me," Robert said, his tone suggesting he'd been delivered a particularly disappointing package. "Elena Martinez, former pediatric nurse." He emphasized the word former like it was a disease, letting it hang in the air between them. "I suppose they told you about your incident 3 years ago? The medication error that cost that child his life." Elena felt the familiar stab of pain pierce through her chest. The same pain that had haunted her every single day since that terrible night at St. Mary's Hospital. She forced herself to stand straighter, to meet his gaze, even as her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "Yes, Mr. Johnson," she replied quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside her. "They told me. And I assume they also told you that 17 caregivers have already quit this position." Robert's lips curved into a cruel smile, the kind of expression that made it clear he enjoyed holding power over people who had nowhere else to turn. "Let me be perfectly clear about something. Ms. Martinez," Robert continued, stepping closer until Elena could smell his expensive cologne mixed with a faint scent of whiskey on his breath. "My aunts, Margaret and Dorothy, are not your typical elderly patients. They have advanced dementia, and they can be volatile, violent, even they scream, they throw things, they don't recognize anyone, and they require round-the-clock supervision because they're a danger to themselves and others." He paused, watching her face for any sign of fear or hesitation. The previous caregivers lasted anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks before they came running to me, begging to be released from their contracts. Some of them were experienced psychiatric nurses, trained professionals who thought they could handle anything. Elena listened to every word, her heart pounding as she tried to process what she was walking into. But she knew she had no choice. This job was her last chance to prove she could still make a difference, still provide comfort to those who needed it most. Robert walked over to the massive oak desk that dominated one corner of the foyer and picked up a thick manila folder, waving it in Elena's direction like evidence in a courtroom. "This is your file, Ms. Martinez. It makes for a fascinating reading, really. Top of your class in nursing school, 5 years of exemplary service in pediatrics, awards for compassionate care, glowing recommendations from patients' families." His voice took on a mocking sing-song quality as he flipped through the pages. "And then, one night shift, one simple medication calculation, one decimal point in the wrong place, and a 7-year-old boy named Tommy Henderson goes into cardiac arrest and dies before morning." Elena's breath caught in her throat as she heard Tommy's name spoken aloud, the sound of it hitting her like a physical blow. She closed her eyes for just a moment, seeing Tommy's sweet face in her mind, remembering how he'd asked her to read him one more story before she administered what should have been a routine dose of pain medication. "Mr. Johnson," Elena began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know what happened that night was unforgivable. I know I made a mistake that cost a child his life, and I have to live with that every single day." She opened her eyes and looked directly at him, refusing to let him see her break down completely. "But I also know that I have years of experience caring for people who can't care for themselves, and I believe I can help your aunts find some peace in their final time." Robert threw back his head and laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the high ceilings and marble walls. "Peace! Miss Martinez, my aunts are beyond peace. They're beyond hell. They're vegetables who happen to still be breathing, and the only reason I haven't put them in some state facility is because my late mother made me promise to keep them here, in the home where they grew up. His expression grew even colder as he leaned against the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. You're not here to provide some miraculous healing time. You're here to make sure they don't hurt themselves or destroy the house while they slowly deteriorate. Elena felt a familiar fire begin to burn in her chest. The same determination that had carried her through nursing school when professors doubted her ability. The same strength that had sustained her through countless difficult nights in the pediatric ward when children cried for their mothers and she was all they had. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I understand your skepticism, and I understand why you might question my abilities given my past. But I'm here because I believe everyone deserves dignity and compassion in their final days, regardless of their condition." Robert pushed himself away from the desk and walked back toward her, his footsteps heavy with irritation. "Dignity and compassion," he repeated mockingly. "How noble of you. Tell me, Miss Martinez, did Tommy Henderson's family feel you provided their son with dignity and compassion when your incompetence killed him?" The words hit Elena like a slap across the face, and she felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. But she forced herself to remain standing, to keep looking him in the eye. "I think about Tommy every day," Elena replied, her voice trembling with emotion, but growing steadier with each word. "I think about his family, about the pain I caused them, about the future I stole from that beautiful little boy. But I also know that dwelling in guilt and shame doesn't honor his memory or help anyone else who needs care." He took a deep breath, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't even know she still possessed. "I can't bring Tommy back, but I can make sure that your aunt's remaining time is filled with as much comfort and kindness as possible." Robert studied her for a long moment, his expression shifting from outright contempt to something that might have been grudging curiosity. "You talk a good game, Ms. Martinez, but talk is cheap. My aunts are upstairs right now, probably screaming their heads off or trying to tear apart their room. The day nurse who's been covering the night shift for the past week looks like she's aged 10 years, and she's practically begging me to find someone else." "What exactly are their symptoms?" Elena asked, shifting into a professional mode, despite the personal attack she'd just endured. "You mentioned violence and screaming, but what specific behaviors are you seeing? Are they on any medications? What does that daily routine look like?" Robert seemed surprised by the clinical nature of her questions, as if he hadn't expected her to focus on practical matters after their heated exchange. "They're on multiple medications, anti-anxiety drugs, mood stabilizers, sleep aids. The doctor says it's the only way to keep them manageable. As for their routine," he shrugged dismissively, "they eat when the day nurse can get them to eat, they sleep when the drugs knock them out, and they spend the rest of the time either completely unresponsive or having episodes where they become aggressive and confused." Elena nodded, filing away each piece of information and already beginning to form a picture of what she might be dealing with upstairs. "Mr. Johnson," Elena said carefully, "I'd like to review their medical files and speak with their current doctor about their treatment plan. Sometimes, when patients with dementia become agitated or violent, it's because something in their environment or medication regimen isn't working for them." Robert's eyebrows shot up in apparent disbelief. "Are you seriously questioning their doctor's judgment? Dr. Phillips has been treating elderly patients for over 20 years. He knows what he's doing." Elena felt a familiar frustration rising in her chest, the same frustration she'd felt countless times when dealing with medical professionals who saw patients as problems to be managed rather than human beings to be understood. "I'm not questioning anyone's judgment, Mr. Johnson. I'm simply saying that sometimes a fresh perspective can be helpful, especially when dealing with complex cases like advanced dementia." Robert shook his head, his expression making it clear that he thought she was overstepping her boundaries before she'd even started the job. "Let me make something crystal clear. Ms. Martinez," Robert said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he probably used in courtrooms. "You are not a doctor. You are not a nurse. You are a disgraced former medical professional who lost her license because of gross negligence, and you are here to provide basic custodial care. Nothing more." Each word felt like a dagger being twisted in Elena's chest, but she forced herself to remain calm, to remember why she was here and what she hoped to accomplish. You will follow Dr. Phillips' treatment plan to the letter. You will give them their medications exactly as prescribed. You will keep them clean, fed, and safe. That is the extent of your responsibilities." He walked over to his side table and picked up a set of keys, holding them out to her. "The night shift starts at 8 Policio Militar ends Hachi, 8 a.m. Their rooms are on the second floor, East Wing. There's a monitoring station set up in the hallway where you can watch both rooms on camera feeds." Elena took the keys, their metal cold against her palm, and looked down at them for a moment before raising her eyes to meet Robert's again. "What were they like before the dementia?" she asked quietly. "Your aunts. I mean, what kind of people were they?" For just a moment, something flickered across Robert's face, a shadow of sadness, perhaps, or a memory of better times. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by his usual mask of cold efficiency. "It doesn't matter what they were like before," he said curtly. "They're not those people anymore. They haven't been for years." Elena felt her heart break a little at his words, at the callousness with which he dismissed the women who had once been vibrant, living human beings with hopes and dreams and stories of their own. "Margaret was a teacher," she said softly, surprising him with her knowledge. "And Dorothy was an artist. I've read about them online before I came here." Robert's face hardened again, as if she had somehow violated his privacy by researching his family. "Whatever you think you know about them is irrelevant," he snapped. "The women you read about online died years ago when the disease took their minds. What's left upstairs are shells, empty vessels that require feeding and medicating and cleaning up after." Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not for herself, but for Margaret and Dorothy, trapped in bodies that no longer served them, cared for by people who saw them as burdens rather than human beings deserving of love and respect. "With all due respect, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I don't believe anyone is ever truly gone as long as they're still breathing. Sometimes it just takes patience and understanding to find the person who's still there, hidden beneath the confusion and fear." Robert stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, annoyance, and something that might have been pity. "You really believe that, don't you?" he asked finally. "You actually think you can work some kind of miracle up there, connect with two women who don't even know their own names anymore?" Elena straightened her shoulders, feeling the familiar surge of determination that had sustained her through nursing school, through difficult cases, through the darkest period of her life after Tommy's death. "I believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and compassion, regardless of their condition," she replied. "I believe that even if they can't communicate in ways we understand, they can still feel love and kindness and respect." Robert shook his head slowly, as if she were a naive child who still believed in fairy tales. "Ms. Martinez, you're going to learn very quickly that good intentions and positive thinking don't mean much when you're dealing with the reality of advanced dementia." "Mr. Johnson," Elena said, taking a step closer to him, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "3 years ago, I made a terrible mistake that cost a child his life. I lost everything, my career, my reputation, my sense of self. I've spent every day since then wondering if I could ever make amends, ever find a way to honor Tommy's memory by helping someone else." She paused, her voice catching slightly as she continued. "I can't bring that little boy back, but I can make sure that your aunt's remaining time is filled with as much love and care as I can possibly provide. That's not naive optimism, Mr. Johnson. That's a promise." Robert studied her face for a long moment, and Elena could see him trying to decide whether she was sincere or simply desperate enough to say whatever she thought he wanted to hear. Finally, he glanced at his expensive watch and sighed heavily. "It's 7:30. The day nurse, Mrs. Patterson, will brief you on their current condition, and then she's leaving. After that, you're on your own until 8 a.m. As they climbed the grand staircase toward the second floor, Elena could hear sounds coming from somewhere down the hallway, a low moaning that seemed to go on, punctuated by occasional shouts or crashes. Robert's jaw tightened with each sound, and Elena could see the stress and exhaustion written across his face, despite his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair. "That's Margaret," he said tersely. "She's been like that since about 3 p.m. Sometimes she goes on for hours." They reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the east wing, passing several closed doors, before stopping in front of a small desk set up in the hallway with multiple monitors showing different angles of 2 bedrooms. Mrs. Patterson, a heavy-set woman in her 50s with graying hair and tired eyes, looked up at them with a mixture of relief and sympathy. "Thank God you're here," she said to Elena, rising from her chair with obvious fatigue. "I don't know how much more of this I could take." "How have they been today?" Elena asked, immediately focusing on the professional aspects of the handoff rather than the emotional weight of the situation. Mrs. Patterson glanced nervously at Robert before answering. "Margaret's been agitated since this afternoon. She keeps trying to get out of bed and becomes violent when we try to redirect her. Dorothy's been mostly unresponsive, but she refused to eat dinner and threw her medication across the room when I tried to give it to her." Elena nodded, filing away each piece of information while studying the monitor screens that showed 2 elderly women in hospital-style beds, both appearing distressed in their own ways. Margaret was indeed moving restlessly, pulling out her blankets and making the moaning sounds they had heard from downstairs, while Dorothy lay completely still, staring at the ceiling with vacant eyes. "What medications are they currently on?" "Elena, ask it!" And Mrs. Patterson handed her a detailed chart with dosages and timing schedules that made Elena's eyebrows rise slightly. The list of medications was extensive: powerful anti-anxiety drugs, mood stabilizers, sleep aids, and antipsychotics, all in doses that seemed unusually high for elderly patients. Elena studied the chart carefully, her nursing training kicking in as she noticed several potential interactions and side effects that could actually be contributing to the women's agitation rather than helping it. "These are quite high doses," she observed carefully, not wanting to directly contradict the doctor's orders, but feeling compelled to voice her concerns. "Have they been on this regimen for a long time?" Mrs. Patterson nodded wearily. "Dr. Phillips increased the doses about 6 months ago when they started having more episodes. He said it was the only way to keep them manageable." Robert stepped forward, his voice sharp with warning. "Ms. Martinez, I hope you're not planning to question Dr. Phillips' treatment plan on your first day." Elena met his gaze steadily. "Of course not, Mr. Johnson. I'm simply trying to understand their current condition and care requirements." Mrs. Patterson gathered her things quickly, clearly eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the second floor. "Margaret's room is the first door on the right. Dorothy's is across the hall," she explained as she prepared to leave. "There's an intercom system if you need to call for help, though honestly, I'm not sure what kind of help you could expect at night." She paused at the top of the stairs and turned back to Elena with a look of genuine concern. "I've been doing this kind of work for 15 years, dear, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Those 2 women are trapped in their own minds, and there's nothing any of us can do except try to keep them from hurting themselves or each other." With that sobering assessment, she disappeared down the staircase, leaving Elena alone with Robert and the sound of Margaret's continued moaning echoing through the hallway. "Well, Miss Martinez," Robert said, checking his watch again, "it's officially 8 p.m., which means you're now on duty. I'll be in my study downstairs if there's an emergency, but I expect you to handle whatever comes up without disturbing me, unless it's absolutely necessary." He started to walk away, then turned back with an expression that managed to be both condescending and threatening. "And Miss Marchini, remember that everything you do up here reflects on your ability to follow instructions and maintain employment. I'd hate to have to add another failure to your already impressive record." Elena felt the familiar sting of his words, but she also felt something else, a growing sense of purpose and determination that surprised her with its intensity. "I understand, Mr. Johnson," she replied quietly. "I won't let you down." He made a sound that might have been a laugh or a snort of derision. "We'll see about that." After Robert's footsteps faded away down the staircase, Elena stood alone in the hallway for a moment, listening to the sounds coming from both rooms and trying to center herself for what lay ahead. Margaret's moaning had grown louder, and now Elena could hear the sound of something being thrown against a wall from Dorothy's room. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of all the difficult patients she had cared for during her years in pediatrics, Children in pain, frightened and confused, lashing out at anyone who tried to help them. The situations were different, but the core principles remained the same: patience, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to seeing the person behind the illness. She walked over to the monitoring station and studied the screens more carefully, watching Margaret's restless movements and Dorothy's occasional violent outbursts, trying to understand what might be triggering their distress. Elena's first instinct was to visit Dorothy's room, since she seemed to be in the midst of an active episode. She knocked gently on the door before entering, even though she knew Dorothy probably couldn't understand or respond appropriately. The room was in disarray, pillows on the floor, a water pitcher overturned on the nightstand, and medication pills scattered across the carpet where Dorothy had apparently thrown them. Dorothy herself was sitting up in bed, her gray hair wild around her face, her eyes wide and frightened as she stared at Elena with obvious suspicion. "Hello, Dorothy," Elena said softly, staying near the door and making no sudden movements. "My name is Elena, and I'm here to take care of you tonight." Dorothy's response was to grab the nearest object, a box of tissue, and hurl it in Elena's direction while making a sound that was part growl, part scream. Elena didn't flinch or retreat, having learned long ago that showing fear often escalated these situations. Instead, she slowly picked up the tissue box and placed it on a chair well out of Dorothy's reach, then began carefully cleaning up the scattered medications while speaking in a calm, soothing voice. "I know you're upset, Dorothy. I know you're scared and confused, and that must be terrifying for you." Dorothy continued to watch her warily, but the throwing stopped, and Elena took that as a positive sign. "I used to take care of children who were scared and in pain, and I learned that sometimes the best thing I could do was just sit with them, quietly, until they felt safe." She finished gathering the pills and sat down in the chair near the door, far enough away to not feel threatening, but close enough to respond quickly if needed. For the next hour, Elena simply sat in Dorothy's room, occasionally speaking in soft, reassuring tones, but mostly just maintaining a calm presence while Dorothy gradually settled down. It was a technique she had learned during her pediatric training sometimes. The most powerful intervention was simply being there, providing a sense of safety and stability in the midst of chaos and confusion. Slowly, Dorothy's breathing became more regular, her posture less rigid, and she stopped scanning the room as if looking for threats. Elena noticed that Dorothy's eyes, while still vacant, seemed to focus on her occasionally, as if some part of her mind was trying to process this new person who wasn't trying to force medications on her or restrain her movements. "That's better," Elena said softly when Dorothy finally lay back down on her pillows. "You're safe now." "I'm not going anywhere." Around 10 p.m., Elena heard Margaret's moaning intensify, and she reluctantly left Dorothy's room to check on her. Margaret's room was similar in layout, but decorated with what had once probably been cheerful yellow wallpaper, now faded and peeling in places. Margaret herself was a tiny woman, probably no more than 90 pounds, but she was thrashing in her bed with surprising strength, pulling at her restraints and calling out words that Elena couldn't quite understand. Unlike Dorothy's frightened aggression, Margaret's distress seemed more like anguish, as if she were in emotional rather than physical pain. Elena approached the bed slowly, speaking in the same calm voice she had used with Dorothy. "Margaret, it's okay. You're safe. My name's Elena, and I'm here to help you." Margaret's eyes fixed on Elena's face for a moment, and Elena could swear she saw a flicker of recognition, not of her personally, but of her role as a caregiver. "Are you in pain, Margaret?" Elena asked, gently checking Margaret's position in the bed and noticing that she was lying awkwardly, with her sheets tangled around her legs in a way that must have been uncomfortable, as Elena carefully straightened the bedding and helped Margaret find a more comfortable position. The older woman's moaning began to subside. Elena realized that what had been interpreted as behavioral problems might actually have been Margaret's way of communicating physical discomfort, something that could easily be overlooked when patients were seen primarily through the lens of their psychiatric symptoms rather than their basic human needs. "There we go," Elena said softly as she smoothed Margaret's blanket and adjusted her pillows. "Is that better?" Margaret's eyes remained fixed on Elena's face, and for just a moment, Elena could have sworn she saw a look of gratitude in those cloudy blue eyes. The rest of the night passed more quietly, with Elena moving between the two rooms, checking on both women regularly and gradually establishing a routine that seemed to provide them with some sense of security. She noticed that both Margaret and Dorothy responded better to her presence when she moved slowly and spoke softly, when she explained what she was doing before she did it, and when she respected their personal space rather than assuming she had the right to touch them or invade their environment without permission. These were basic principles of patient care that Elena had learned years ago, but she realized they were probably being overlooked in the current care plan, which seemed focused more on chemical restraint than on understanding and addressing the underlying causes of the women's distress. By 3 a.m., both rooms were peaceful, with Margaret sleeping naturally and Dorothy lying quietly, occasionally making eye contact with Elena when she checked on her. As Elena sat at the monitoring station during the quiet hours before dawn, she found herself thinking about Robert's dismissive comments about his aunts being empty shells and vegetables. Having spent the night observing Margaret on Dorothy, she was convinced that there were still people inside those diseased minds, people who were frightened and confused but still capable of responding to kindness and respect. The challenge would be convincing Robert and Dr. Phillips that a different approach might be more effective than simply medicating the women into submission. Elena had seen this pattern before in pediatric care. When patients were difficult or disrupted, the tendency was often to increase medications rather than addressing environmental factors that might be contributing to their distress. She began to formulate a plan in her mind, knowing that she would have to be extremely careful about how she approached any suggestions for changes in care. When Mrs. Patterson arrived at 8 a.m. to take over the day shift, she was visibly shocked to find both rooms quiet and both patients resting peacefully. "I don't understand," she said, looking back and forth between the monitor screens and Elena's calm demeanor. "They were both having episodes when I left yesterday evening. Margaret was screaming, and Dorothy was throwing things. What did you do to them?" Elena shook her head, smiling tiredly. "I didn't do anything to them. I just tried to understand what they needed and provided it as best I could." Mrs. Patterson stared at her in amazement. "You mean they actually slept?" "Both of them. All night." Elena nodded, then spent several minutes briefing Mrs. Patterson on the night's events, sharing her observations about what seemed to trigger agitation and what helped calm the women down. Robert appeared at the top of the stairs, just as Elena was preparing to leave, and his expression was one of suspicious disbelief as he took in the peaceful scene. "Mrs. Patterson tells me they actually slept last night," he said, his tone suggesting that he suspected some kind of deception. "What did you give them? Did you increase their medication doses?" Elena felt a familiar frustration rise in her chest at his immediate assumption that she must have done something wrong or inappropriate. "I didn't give them anything except the medications that were prescribed, Mr. Johnson, and I gave them exactly as directed on the chart." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I did notice that they seemed to respond well to a calm environment and gentle interaction. Sometimes what looks like behavioral problems can actually be expressions of unmet needs." Robert's eyes narrowed, and Elena could see that he interpreted her observations as criticism of the current care plan. "Miss Martinez," Robert said, his voice taking on that familiar condescending tone, "I hope you're not suggesting that 17 previous caregivers and a doctor with 20 years of experience don't know how to provide appropriate care for dementia patients." Elena felt her cheeks flush, but she forced herself to remain professional. "Of course not, Mr. Johnson. I'm simply sharing my observations from last night in case they might be helpful for future care planning." Robert studied her face for a moment, clearly trying to decide whether she was being sincere or subtly challenging his authority. "Well," he said finally, "one quiet night doesn't prove anything. Let's see how you handle a full week before we start talking about revolutionary care techniques." With that dismissive comment, he turned and walked back downstairs, leaving Elena to gather her things and head home, her mind already racing with thoughts about how she might gradually introduce changes that could improve Margaret and Dorothy's quality of life. Over the next several nights, Elena continued to observe the two women closely, gradually building what she thought of as a relationship with each of them, despite their cognitive limitations. she began to notice patterns in their behavior. Margaret became most agitated around 7 p.m., which Elena realized coincided with the timing of her evening medications, while Dorothy's outbursts often occurred when she was approached too quickly or when multiple people were in a room at once. Elena started making small adjustments to her approach, timing her visits to coincide with the women's more peaceful moments, and always moving slowly and speaking softly to avoid triggering fear responses. She also began keeping detailed notes about what seemed to help and what seemed to make things worse, building a comprehensive picture of each woman's individual needs and preferences. By the end of her first week, Elena had established enough of a routine that both Margaret and Dorothy seemed to recognize her and respond positively to her presence. Margaret would often reach for Elena's hand when she approached the bed, and Dorothy had stopped throwing things when Elena entered her room. Most remarkably, both women were sleeping through most of the night without the aggressive episodes that had plagued previous caregivers. Mrs. Patterson was amazed by the transformation and began asking Elena for advice about daytime care strategies. "I don't know what you're doing differently," she told Elena one morning, "but whatever it is, it's working." They seem calmer during the day, too, as if the peaceful nights are carrying over. Elena felt a warm glow of satisfaction at the recognition, the first positive feedback she had received about her caregiving abilities since Tommy's death 3 years earlier. However, Robert remained skeptical and dismissive of Elena's success, attributing the improvements to coincidence rather than skill. "Don't get too cocky, Miss Martinez," he warned her at the end of her second week. "Dementia patients often go through cycles of good days and bad days. Just because you've had a string of quiet nights doesn't mean you've solved anything." Elena bit back her frustration, knowing that arguing with him would only reinforce his view of her as insubordinate and unprofessional. Instead, she continued to focus on her work, gradually learning more about Margaret and Dorothy as individuals rather than just as patients to be managed. She discovered that Margaret had been a second-grade teacher for 40 years and still responded positively to children's songs and nursery rhymes, while Dorothy had been an artist who seemed to calm down when Elena showed her pictures of paintings or described colors and textures in detail. 3 weeks into Elena's employment, Dr. Phillips made an unscheduled visit to check on his patients, and Elena could tell immediately that he was not pleased with what he found. Both women were awake and relatively calm when he arrived, Margaret sitting up in bed, looking around her room with what appeared to be curiosity rather than agitation, and Dorothy actually making eye contact with people who entered her room. "Why are they so alert?" he demanded of Elena, as if consciousness were somehow a negative symptom. "Are you following their medication schedule? They should be much more sedated than this, especially during the day." Elena felt her heart sink as she realized that the improvements she had seen as positive developments, Dr. Phillips viewed as problems to be corrected. "I've been giving them the medications exactly as prescribed," she assured him, though she had been timing the doses to coincide with their natural rhythms rather than rigidly adhering to clock-based schedules. Dr. Phillips spent less than 10 minutes examining each woman, during which time he seemed more interested in their compliance and docility than in their overall well-being or quality of life. "I'm going to increase their evening medication doses," he announced to Robert, who had joined them for the consultation. "They're too agitated, too aware of their surroundings. We need to keep them calmer." Elena felt a surge of panic as she realized that her careful work to help the women find some peace and dignity was about to be undone by a doctor who saw their emerging humanity as a medical problem. "Dr. Phillips," she said carefully, "they've been sleeping well and seem less distressed overall. Is it possible that they're actually improving rather than becoming more agitated?" The doctor turned to her with an expression of barely concealed annoyance. "Miss Martinez, you're not qualified to assess their condition. Dementia patients don't improve. They deteriorate. What you're seeing as improvement is actually increased confusion and agitation that needs to be controlled." That night, Elena was forced to administer the higher medication doses that Dr. Phillips had ordered, and she watched with a heavy heart as both Margaret and Dorothy quickly became heavily sedated and unresponsive. Margaret, who had been reaching for Elena's hand, and making what sounded like attempts at communication, now lay motionless and barely conscious. Dorothy, who had begun to show interest in her surroundings and had even smiled when Elena sang softly to her, was back to staring blankly at the ceiling with vacant eyes. Elena felt like she was watching two people die all over again, not from their disease, but from the treatment that was supposed to help them. She spent the night sitting with them, holding their hands and talking to them, even though they could no longer respond, trying to maintain some connection to the women she had briefly glimpsed beneath the fog of dementia. Over the next several days, Elena struggled with an increasingly difficult moral dilemma. She could see that the increased medications were making Margaret and Dorothy's lives worse, not better, but she had no authority to change their treatment plan and was specifically forbidden from questioning Dr. Phillips' decisions. She watched as the women slipped back into the barely conscious state that had characterized their condition before her arrival, and she felt like she was failing them just as she had failed Tommy Henderson 3 years earlier. The guilt was overwhelming, made worse by Robert's satisfied comments about how much better his aunts were now that they were properly medicated. "This is exactly what I was hoping for when we hired you," he told her one evening. "They're finally manageable, finally peaceful. Dr. Phillips really knows what he's doing." Elena wanted to scream that this wasn't peace. It was chemical imprisonment. The turning point came during Elena's 6th week on the job, when Robert's 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, was rushed to the hospital with symptoms that had doctors baffled. Elena learned about the emergency when Robert called the house at 2 a.m., his voice tight with panic as he explained that he wouldn't be home and that Elena would need to handle any emergencies on her own. "Sophia collapsed during dinner," he said, his usual composure completely shattered. "She's having seizures, and her temperature is spiking, but the doctors can't figure out what's wrong. They're running every test they can think of, but—" His voice broke, and Elena could hear the terror of a father facing the possible loss of his child. Just keep my aunts quiet, okay? I can't deal with any problems there right now." Elena assured him that she would handle everything, but her mind was already racing as she processed the symptoms he had described. After hanging up the phone, Elena found herself pacing the hallway outside Margaret and Dorothy's rooms, her nursing instincts fully engaged as she thought through the possible causes of Sophia's condition. Seizures combined with high fever in a previously healthy child suggested either an infection that had spread to the brain, a toxic exposure, or possibly an autoimmune reaction triggered by a recent illness or vaccination. Elena realized that her years of pediatric experience might give her insights that adult emergency room doctors wouldn't immediately consider, especially if they were focusing on more common adult causes of similar symptoms. She picked up her phone several times, wanting to call Robert and share her thoughts, but each time she stopped herself, knowing that he would dismiss any suggestions from someone he considered a failed nurse with no credibility. By 4 a.m., Elena couldn't stand the waiting and uncertainty any longer. She called Robert's cell phone, knowing that he probably wouldn't answer, but feeling compelled to try. To her surprise, he picked up on the second ring, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and fear. "Elena, is something wrong with my aunts?" She could hear the chaos of the hospital in the background, beeping machines, hurried footsteps, urgent voices. "No, Mr. Johnson, your aunts are fine," she assured him quickly. "I'm calling about Sophia. I know you probably don't want to hear from me right now, but I have some experience with pediatric cases that present with seizures and fever, and I wondered if I could ask you a few questions that might help the doctors narrow down their diagnosis." There was a long pause, and Elena could practically feel Robert's internal struggle between his desperate need for answers and his ingrained dismissal of her abilities. "What kind of questions?" Robert asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena took a deep breath, knowing that she had one chance to provide information that might help save this child's life. "Has Sophia had any recent infections, even minor ones like